Welcome to the USS Scorpion sub-brief. The USS Scorpion was the second United States nuclear submarine to be lost. One of the two other submarines was the USS Thresher that was lost in 1962, beginning the SUBSAFE program to prevent that from happening again. And some 6 years later, 1968, USS Scorpion is lost in mysterious circumstances that we're going to cover today. So she's 76 meters long, 3,500 tons, has 6 torpedo tubes, all 21 inch, also 53 centimeters, same size. She could carry 24 Mark 37 torpedoes or Mark 14 torpedoes, Mark 16, Mark 54, 27, called the Cutie, and also Mark 48 was carried on the Skipjack-class that the Scorpion was. So loss of the Scorpion is still a bit of a mystery. Like I said, it happened in 1968. The wreckage was identified some 6 months after she failed to report in the North Atlantic, some 400 miles southwest of the Azores. Here's the general layout of the submarine according to Wikipedia. It's generally correct. You can see the torpedo room is up forward. The reactor's in the middle, and the engine room is almost half the submarine, because this was an S5W design. That's a Westinghouse design, Generation 5, very early on. Everything was very big. This was built in the 1960s, designed in the 1950s. So that's the technology we're working with when it comes to the engine room there. But the sensors were really, really impressive. Let's start with the WLR-11. That's the radar warning receiver. It was a combination of a WLR-1G and a WLR-3 and an ALR-52, which comes together to make the WLR-11 suite. Basically, it detects a radar, has a maximum range of over 200 kilometers, so it's very sensitive. Even if the radar is on very low power, it will detect it and give frequency information on the radar that's out there. So very good stuff. There were some upgrades made to the class here, the BPS-12 radar. We called it beeps, by the way. If anytime you see AN-BPS, that is a submarine radar, and we just shortened BPS to beeps. So the BEEPS-12 was a surface search radar, basically used for navigation along the coastline, so we didn't run into it. Later upgraded to the BEEPS-15 for the other 688 class. The BEEPS-12 is... the BEEPS-4 is the hull-mounted active sonar. Pings, has a max range of like 7.5 kilometers rather. Very, very short range, very archaic World War II basically technology, wrapped in a 1950s finish. The WLR-9 though, this thing is still on board submarines today. The WLR-9 was the product of a madman basically, and was generations ahead of itself. It was like having a current iPhone in the 1980s. Yeah, I had this on my first boat, the WLR-9. I was a specialist on this piece of equipment because it was so advanced. This piece of equipment had its own school. And what it was an acoustic intercept warning receiver and torpedo detector. And the engineering of the circuitry in this thing was like something from Mars. It was incredibly advanced, but using components of the 1960s. So it was large and very difficult to operate, very difficult to troubleshoot if something went wrong with it. There are many stories of the WLR-9 not functioning properly and people not recognizing that it was not working properly, is how advanced this thing was. So WLR-9, one of the most important pieces of gear, sonar gear, on any American submarine, and it's still in service today. Absolutely amazing piece of tech. And they had it on the Scorpion. An earlier version of it. This thing's been evolving for decades. Acronym STASS, that's the towed array. The BKR-25 STASS, or STASS, is the submarine towed array sonar system. It consists basically of a long cable with hydrophones on it. It's capable of being deployed behind the submarine and being towed. The cool thing about the STASS, or the inconvenient thing, is we had to pull out a port, go down the river, and at the marker buoy, which is the end of the channel, meet up with a tug that had our towed array on a big reel on the back. and they would send a diver down and physically connect it to our tow cable that was on the submarine that connected it into the sonar system inside as well. And that took a couple hours. And once that was done, we could finally unspool the towed array from this tugboat and then go on our deployment. There was no way originally to reel in or deploy a towed array at sea. You had to do it whenever you came in and out of port. Just take it on and off a tugboat. Real pain in the butt. Eventually that system was improved with a handling system inside the ballast tanks, but originally we had no such system. So she's commissioned in 1960 and is decommissioned officially in 1968 when she's lost, the USS Scorpion. She's made in the United States, specifically Electric Boat, located in Groton, Connecticut, right there on the Thames River. Very close to the new London naval base that hosts all the submarines on the East Coast, besides Norfolk. But it's a large submarine base with the submarine school there. And, of course, Kings Bay down in Georgia has our nuclear ballistic missile submarines as well, I should mention. All right, so USS Scorpion, by the numbers, she has one S5W nuclear reactor, Westinghouse steam turbine, turns one shaft, Generation 5 steam reactor, built by Westinghouse. She's over 3,500 tons, fully loaded, can do 28 knots, has 6 torpedo tubes, can shoot a lot of different torpedoes that we're going to go over in detail here for you. This should almost be a torpedo brief at this point. Mark 37, 14, Mark 16, Mark 27, and Mark 45 torpedoes were able to shoot by the Scorpion. We do mention the Mark 48 because the class that the Scorpion was a part of later on could shoot the Mark 48, but the USS Scorpion at this time did not. She only had these torpedoes here. Okay, the WLR-11, RWR, and Beeps 12 equipment on board, like we already talked about. Sonar suites. They had the towed array. They had the active sonar, the WLR-9 acoustic intercept, which was incredible, and the BQR-21, which was like dial-a-bearing passive sonar. You would, like old World War II, spin the wheel, and you were listening to whatever direction the wheel was pointing, 360 degrees. And served in the United States Navy for 8 years. So here's what the S5W reactor looks like. This is the hull with the plating that's going to, obviously the reactor is going to fit inside that. You're looking into what is the engine room before they put all the components into it. Very rare picture here from TAFON. So thank you for our researcher who found this. So the S5W, S is for submarine, 5 is for 5th generation, W is for Westinghouse. So you'll hear a lot of S6W. Current generation, I think, is S9W for the current Virginia. So, but that's what the letters mean. It's a 2-loop pressurized water reactor. Can produce 78 megawatts and weighs 650 tons. Has a core life equivalent of 5,500 full power hours. So that's her going critical. And once you reach that time limit, that's how they measure the life of reactors. It's time to refuel her. Current reactors last much longer than this. This is very early tech, very early generation. Here's that Beeps 12 radar I told you about. Basically, it's a navigation radar. It is surface search. We use it when we're near port, basically, to make sure that we don't run into the shoreline. And then you have the WLR-11 RWR. This is that ECM receiver. Gives frequency information to detected radars. Here's the BQR-21 hull-mounted passive sonar. You can see the cool sonar operator with his arm over the chair, not looking at his display like a proper sonarman. And you see that wheel in front of him? Looks like a steering wheel. Yeah, that's the wheel you would use to steer the bug, we would call it, because there would be a little cursor on the display that looked like a white dot or orange dot because it had orange coloring on it. And you would steer the bug around in a 360-degree fashion, and whatever direction that little cursor was pointing in was the direction you were listening to. So you can only listen to one direction at a time. And if you saw detection somewhere else, like if there was an increase in noise in another direction, you would have to go over to it and listen to it. You couldn't see multiple bearings at the same time. Could track 5 targets at a time. Max range was 87 nautical miles. Listen, anytime you see range on a sonar, it depends on a lot of things. But it did have digital multi-beam steering, so that's kind of a big generational leap. We're leaving the analog mechanical rotary drum that is physically spinning in the sonar sphere at the bow of the submarine behind. That's World War II tech. This is digital beamforms in a digital beamformer computer that is changing the phase of sound. And I could do a whole lecture on just that sentence, but it's digitally steering the beams, so you're listening different directions without any mechanical involvement besides the steering wheel where you're telling the beamformer to go. There was a piece of equipment that turned mechanical input into electrical input, and that was called a compensator. And so that's what he's steering, is the arm of the compensator, which is in a computer that then tells the beamformer how to steer the beams. Yep. Very cool stuff. Combination of mechanical and electrical engineering coming together. Now it's all digital. All right, BQS-4, active passive sonar. This is the old-fashioned World War II, ping, echo, rangefinder, 360 degrees, and hope you get a return. And good luck with that, with this system. In good conditions, you could see 5 miles, maybe. Yeah. And that's if you had a cooperative target, too. And then the BQR-25 STAS, that's that towed array. You'll basically just see low-frequency data from that, and it was very difficult to get good bearings from, but it was extremely sensitive. That was the good thing about the towed array, is it gave our submarines very long detection ranges. I mean, we're talking tens of miles, many tens of miles. And so this was a whole new long range capability. Like before towed array, we could see maybe, 20 miles on a good day, maybe 40 if you got lucky and got that long range convergence zone. So rarely would you see outside 20 miles is my point. You put out a towed array, you're looking for much farther than that. Yeah. Now it's a matter of, there's some problems that come with that as well, because you don't always know how far away the contact is, and you got to do certain things with your submarine, and it takes time to what we call localize, because the detections are so far away and so low frequency. But huge improvement. Once we had the BQR-25, we took it with us every single time we went underway. And of course, the towed arrays have just gotten better and better since then. All right, let's talk about torpedoes. Good Lord, there's a bunch of these things, so buckle up. The Mark 37 electric torpedo developed by the United States in the mid-20th century, electrically driven torpedo, powered by an electric motor which received its energy from batteries inside the torpedo. So guidance control was a gyroscope with a depth-keeping mechanism to maintain its course and depth during its underwater run. It carried an explosive warhead designed to inflict damage on submarines. The exact specifications, though, are secret to this day, even though the torpedo is out of service. Seeker and sensor torpedo was equipped with acoustic sensors such as hydrophones, so it had acoustic homing on this torpedo. And it was launched from surface ships, including cruisers and destroyers, as well as submarines. Very historically significant torpedo, the Mark 37. Here's the Mark 14. A lot of you might recognize this because this one dates all the way back to World War II. And yes, it was used on the USS Scorpion, was in the torpedo room anyway. The Mark 14 was initially powered by a steam engine, and but later Mark 14 Mod 3 and Mod 4 did have electric motors. The guidance system was a combined gyroscope and depth-keeping mechanism, just like the Mark 37. The warhead was a high explosive warhead that weighed 643 pounds, designed to inflict significant damage on large ships. So if you're shooting a carrier, you're shooting a cruiser, you're shooting this torpedo at it. So range and speed is about, the range was only about 4,500 yards. Speed was about 46 knots. So for World War II, that was good, but after that, not so great. The Mark 14 torpedo did have some passive acoustic homing capability on later mods, but its own self noise was so loud that was never really effective. So it might as well have just been a straight running torpedo. Mark 16 torpedo was redesigned for the Mark 14. After World War II, the Mark 16 incorporates improvements and modifications based on operational experience and technological advancements. Here are some features like the power source is an electric motor instead of a steam engine like the early Mark 14s had. Mark 16 also uses a gyroscope and depth-keeping mechanism to keep its course underwater, but it employed magnetic influence exploders for detonation. So it didn't always have to hit the target directly. If it got close to the target, it would then detonate. It was a high explosive warhead, and they had varying sizes of warhead on the Mark 16. The range was 4,500 yards at 46 knots, so not a big improvement over the Mark 14 over that. And the Mark 16 torpedo retained passive acoustic homing capability, and because it was quieter, that was a little bit more effective. So, Mark 27 torpedo, probably one of the most adored torpedoes in the submarine service, also known as the Cutie, is a small anti-submarine torpedo developed during World War II, and it was used pretty effectively in World War II from airdropped anti-submarine patrols. But it could also be shot out of the 21-inch torpedo tubes of an American submarine because, if you look closely at the picture, you can see the wood fins that are on the top and bottom of this running along the body of the torpedo. So it takes this 19-inch torpedo and lets it fit in a 21-inch torpedo tube without it rolling around in there because it has those little guides, if you will. It was designed to be used against submarines, and like I said, it could be launched from both aircraft, torpedo bombers, and submarines. The warhead was pretty small. It was only about 45 kilograms, which is about 100 pounds, roughly. So it was designed to impact and cause damage to subs, punch a hole in it, and let the seawater do the rest of the work. The Mark 47 torpedo was wire guided, so if the submarine shot it, they could remotely control it. Obviously, if it was airdropped, it was not wire guided. And the propulsion was a wet heater steam engine, which used a combination of pressurized steam and alcohol as its fuel. This propulsion system was necessary for this torpedo's type of transmission that it had. And it was very small, a tiny little thing compared to the other torpedoes in the torpedo room. And that's where it got the name the Cutie. One that's not so cute is the Mark 45 Astra. This is America's nuclear torpedo. That's right. So it's still conventionally powered. And it is acoustically homed, but it has a Mark 34 nuclear warhead on it that will give anyone a bad day who's in the vicinity. It goes about 40 knots, has 11 kiloton warhead, which is more than enough to sink any submarine or ship within 1,000 or 2,000 yards of it. It's going to just annihilate it. And this one was very terrifying because the range was not very far. It was like, which is what, a couple miles. So even the launching platform was going to be in jeopardy of taking damage from the shockwave this thing produced. So, and we had special procedures for shooting this thing because even though the boats I was on never had it, we still had the procedures, and we would practice if we ever had to shoot these, what those were, and it was pretty intense. So nuclear torpedoes were in the United States arsenal for many years during the Cold War, and the Mark 45 Astra torpedo was the primary one for our submarines. All right, so what happened to the USS Scorpion? Well, on May 22nd, 1968, she failed to check in while returning to port from the Mediterranean Sea. So a search and rescue operation was launched, and it took several days to find the wreckage. On October 30th, 1968, the submarine was finally found 400 miles southwest of the Azores at 10,000 feet of depth. That's still not as deep as the Titanic is, but it's still too deep for this submarine. And here you can see the photos. The pressure that this submarine is in is actually crushing the plates there in that center photo of the stern planes. So the stern planes are a combination of two things. You have a part of the stern plane that is metal that has ribs in it and is hollow. And then there's a hinge for the control surface that pivots up and down. So just forward of the hinge, you can see where those ribbings, the plates have been compressed by the immense pressure that is crushing the plate in between each reinforcement rib. And that's also happening on the control surface aft of that hinge. but it's much more predominant, visible anyway, just forward of the hinge there. That's the types of pressures we're talking about at 10,000 feet, because you have 10,000 feet of ocean on top of you pushing down on you, if you want to think of it that way. Here's more photos for you. Investigation of the sinking suggests that possibly there was an internal explosion causing it to rapidly sink, which is why we didn't see any kind of radio distress call or anything from this. Loss of the Scorpion remains a subject of interest and speculation. This is true. So here is a map for you. They were coming from the Mediterranean Sea back to Norfolk, May 1968, when she just simply didn't check in anymore. And a little bit more to the story is the Navy, repeatedly called for her, told her to surface, and she was due in. They didn't tell the families until, she was late pulling in. Like, they had the tugboats ready to take the towed array off the end of her, sitting at the end of the channel marker on the day she was going to pull in, hoping that maybe there was just a radio problem. But no, she never arrived at the end of the channel to pull into Norfolk. And that's when they knew that, their worst fears had been confirmed. So she was last talked to or last communicated with in May 1968. And that's where she lays today, is 400 miles southwest of the Azores. This is a little bit of history. She did have a lot of problems. There was electrical fire occurred in an escape trunk when water leaked and shorted out the shore power connection. That's not just a class problem. That just happens sometimes. That you'd be surprised. The escape trunks leaked regularly enough that we had to drain them while underway. Yeah. So that's a problem for all submarines, I think. That's not unique to the Scorpion. But that's where the electrical connections are for shore power. And while those would not be energized underway, if you did not line up your electrical system properly, they certainly could be, I suppose. And then you would have a problem. And that's apparently what happened to the Scorpion before this incident at all. So loss of the Scorpion remains of interest, and speculation continues. Here's a list of her technical defects. She had chronic issues. There were 109 unfulfilled work orders to fix systems on board this boat before she was lost. So she had a lot of things wrong with her before she went on deployment. Things broke while she was on her med patrol in 1968. And there were a total of 109 work orders waiting for her for whenever she pulled in. She was going to have this massive amount of work done to her. So 2 months before her loss, the Scorpion's captain had drafted an emergency work order for the hull, which he claimed was in very poor state of preservation. So the hull on a submarine, you have to take care of the inside and the outside of it. And I can only guess as to what he's referring to, but there are a lot of hull penetrations. Everything from the trash disposal unit to dozens of electrical penetrations that lead from inside the submarine to outside. And all of those can leak. Any one of those can. And it's a big problem if anything does happen to any of those. So he really wanted he wanted dry dock time, clearly, with this message, and have the hull preserved better. All right, another theory is torpedo explosion. There was a lot of problems with the torpedoes that they had. It says here, there are several reports that the submarine was headed in the opposite direction at the time of the destruction. As anticipated, a common solution for a hot run torpedo room was to turn 180 degrees, which activates a fail-safe. So that is true. That is actually a procedure that we had on board our boats, because the older Mark 48s and the older torpedoes, because of the World War II experience of the torpedo doing a circular run due to a jammed rudder, made the torpedo do a perfect circle. And so if you launch a torpedo and it does a perfect circle, it will always come back to the point that it was launched. And guess where that is? Well, that's where you are shooting the torpedo just a few seconds ago. So because of that, they installed this anti-self-homing mechanism that if a torpedo detected a 180-degree course change for whatever reason, even if it was wire-guided and told to do it, it would shut down. So there is a lot of belief, because they believe that they detected the submarine doing a 180. The only sensors that could have detected that would have been SOSUS, and I don't know how accurate that is, right? Because SOSUS is really good at many things, but target motion analysis is not one of them. Not to this level of accuracy. So unless there was another unit in the area, which there was not, they wouldn't know this for sure. They would just guess at this. Second one, TDU malfunction. This one's actually much more likely. Trash disposal unit is a 10-inch tube that leads from inside the submarine's galley, which is in the mid-level, down this 22-foot, 10-inch round pipe that's, reinforced to absorb pressure from very deep water. It's just as strong as the outside of the hull is, basically. And then you put your trash in it and you pressurize it, and the trash just falls out the bottom with gravity. Yeah. And then you flush it out with water too, but gravity's basically pulling the trash out of the bottom of the boat. Well, this thing, apparently the hatch did not latch properly in the galley. So there was times in the past when water had actually flooded into the Scorpion from the trash disposal unit. And that's really bad, because do you know what's between the trash disposal unit that's in the middle of the submarine and the keel? That's the submarine's battery. And if you get salt water in the submarine's battery, it's going to catch on fire. And anyone that's tried to put out an electrical battery fire knows how difficult that is. It's near impossible. We see this now with electric cars catching on fire. And fire departments are just dumping water and water on these, lithium ion batteries. Well, old school lead cell batteries burn very hot as well. And they're self-feeding as well. So that's what happened on the Scorpion before, is the TDU had malfunctioned, actually caused flooding, and they had to respond to that. They went underway with this problem to the Mediterranean. So it is extremely likely that this is the real incident of the Scorpion disaster. But again, we don't know for sure. But so far, this is the most likely one. Another one that is surprisingly common, especially if you don't get the ventilation lineup right, is a hydrogen explosion from the battery. So the Scorpion could have experienced a hydrogen explosion during or after charging batteries, because whenever you charge batteries, they put off hydrogen gas inside the battery compartment, and you have fans down there to circulate the hydrogen so it doesn't get bunched up in one small area and then become self-igniting, right? So you spread that hydrogen throughout the boat as much as you can, because you're submerged while this is happening, right? It's a nuclear submarine. It can charge batteries without going up to the surface. So the hydrogen level throughout the atmosphere of the entire boat, if the lineup is done properly, goes up by a very tiny amount. But if you don't do that and the hydrogen builds up in that small battery compartment, it can rise rather rapidly during a charge. And even after you're done charging, if you don't get rid of that hydrogen, it just stays there, it becomes extremely flammable. So any kind of spark would instantly ignite the entire thing, and it would all ignite at once in an enclosed space, causing a shock wave, which would cause immense damage. It could even break the submarine apart if this happened. So a hydrogen explosion is the other very likely event that caused the end of the Scorpion. So far we have TDU flooding, shorting out the battery, hydrogen explosion in the battery well, or a torpedo hot run, which is the least likely so far. And let's talk about this one. Okay, the Soviet attack. This one is a straight up conspiracy theory. The conspiracy theory is that the Scorpion was caught up in a Cold War skirmish with a Soviet flotilla, and they had sunk the submarine. The unusual high number of submarines from both sides were sunk in 1968 because they had lost a Yankee, they had lost a ballistic missile submarine over in the Pacific, the Soviets did, and so there was a lot of talk that maybe this was retaliation. But there's actually no proof of this happening, and there was no Soviet flotilla anywhere near the Azores when this happened. There were the closest Soviet submarine deployments, because we watched them on SOSUS, there was a Soviet submarine in the Caribbean thousands of miles to the west, and there were still Soviet submarines, more than one, in the Mediterranean, thousands of miles to the east. There is no physical way a Soviet submarine could possibly have been involved in the loss of the USS Scorpion, because she was literally by herself in the middle of the Atlantic, and we were watching her on SOSUS. That's how we believe we saw a 180-degree turn. So she was by herself when this happened. That is 100% confirmed. There is no grounds whatsoever that this was a Soviet attack. However, you should be aware that this theory still persists out there. It's kind of ridiculous. All right, so final thoughts on the Scorpions. Like I said, it's one of two submarines lost. Very tragic, terrible. This happened after the Thresher. So SUBSAFE, the program that was born after the Thresher loss to make sure that never happened again, that there was never a mechanical failure leading to the loss of an American nuclear submarine, never again, happened again. There was definitely a mechanical failure, whether it was the TDU, whether it was the battery hydrogen, lineup not being right, which could also be operator error, or the least likely cause of a torpedo doing a hot run in the torpedo room and then exploding whenever its destination it thought was reached. Whenever it reached end of run, it just exploded. That is the least likely of options. It's not even how torpedoes work, to be honest with you. But it is possible that if a torpedo malfunctioned, well, then maybe it exploded as well, But the TDU and the hydrogen explosion are the two most likely causes, and also explains why there was no distress call. If this was a simple casualty in a fire, anything that took more than 30 seconds, they could easily get to periscope depth and send off a quick report, even if it's just SOS. Which, if that's all they had time to do, they would have at least done that. They did nothing but disappear. So whatever happened quick. And she just disappeared from SOSUS and also did not communicate with us. And they didn't tell the families. This is kind of a tragic thing. They didn't tell the families until they were absolutely sure. And that was days later. And there's a lot of pros and cons to that because you want to keep hope alive. But once you realize that they're lost, they probably should have told the families a little bit sooner. I remember a story to go along with this. There was a submarine, I don't remember the name of exactly, so I don't want to guess here, but it was in the late 1990s in New London Submarine Base who had lost communication. It was like 1994, 1995, and they did not report in. And they were due back, and they didn't wait. The Navy did not wait. They opened up the chapel on base. They told all the families to come to the chapel, and they informed all the families in the chapel that their submarine had lost communication, and that the submarine had been ordered to surface. They had been ordered to come back to port, and they were just waiting. And it was days later when the submarine finally did communicate again. And I forget the problem with that. It was a technical problem. It was a radio problem. But the Navy kind of learned its lesson from the Scorpion in that they don't wait to tell the families anymore. If there's miscommunication for more than a certain number of hours, and it's not many, they start letting the families know. And so that's how it operates now, because I saw that myself in the 1990s. But going back to the Scorpion, so this is the most significant weapon loss because there was a Mark 45 Astra torpedo fitted with a nuclear warhead on board that's sitting 400 miles, 10,000 feet down from the Azores. She sank after the Mediterranean deployment, as it says here. The commanding officer did report that there was technical issues, including leakage from valves in the submarine. I think the TDU is a very likely component because the people operating the trash disposal unit are often like the least experienced sailors. They're usually supervised by a senior sailor, like a chief petty officer, but the people actually operating it are usually the cooks or the helm whenever he's not on watch, ironically, is responsible for disposing of the trash. At least that's the way it worked on 688s. My point is, very young junior sailors that may not even be submarine dolphin wearing qualified are opening up the trash disposal unit to sea pressure. And this thing didn't work properly. The latch did not latch properly. So again, even the captain's report saying, hey, we're having problems with these things, and TDU is very likely. So the fate of the submarine remains unknown. It's a grave site now. It's a protected site. It's 10,000 feet down. No one can get to it anyway unless they have a very special submarine. And the investigation's officially closed. They're not going to reopen this. It's going to remain a bit of a mystery. We know that it was not a hostile act, and therefore we're going to let the men lie at peace now. All right. So this has been the updated Scorpion brief. I hope you enjoyed it. A little bit somber, but we have to talk about these disasters to make sure that they never happen again. All right. Thanks for watching.